Ever wondered what it was truly like to be a woman living in 630 and imagine a world where your daily existence was punctuated by subtle put-downs, casual dismissals, and quiet expectations that chipped away at your spirit, often without a single harsh word being uttered? What if the very air you breathed, the customs that shaped your life, silently communicated that your worth was less, your voice quieter, your intellect dimmer? Welcome to 630. At a time when women navigated a complex web of unwritten rules, often feeling the sting of microaggressions long before the word even existed. Number 12. Inheritance. Disparity. Imagine a world where your own blood, your very lineage, could subtly diminish your worth, not because of anything you did or said, but simply because of your gender. In 630, and across vast stretches of the known world, from the bustling cities of the Byzantine Empire to the nascent communities of the Arabian Peninsula, from the vast plains of Anglo-Saxon England, the concept of inheritance was often a stark reminder of where women stood in the grand scheme of things. It was not always a direct, cruel denial, but a pervasive, almost invisible expectation that whispered, "This is not truly yours." Consider the case of a wealthy merchant in a Byzantine city. He might have 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. When he passed away, the bulk of his property, his ships, his warehouses, his prime urban dwellings, would naturally, almost instinctively pass to his sons. The daughter might receive a dowry upon marriage, perhaps some personal items, or a smaller portion of movable goods. This was not always legally mandated in every precise detail, but it was deeply ingrained in societal custom. Legal codes, like those stemming from the Roman tradition, often pronatized male heirs, ensuring the continuity of the family name and its patriarchal power. While some legal systems allowed for daughters to inherit, often their share was less, or it might be conditional, or it might pass to her husband upon marriage, effectively shifting control away from her. The subtle message here was profound. The true custodians of wealth, the ones who would perpetuate the family's legacy and power, were overwhelmingly male. Across the Sasanian Persian Empire, the story was often similar. Zoroastrian legal traditions, while recognizing certain rights for women, still placed considerable emphasis on male lineage for the continuation of the family line and the holding of property. A daughter might receive a part of her father's estate, perhaps as part of her marriage settlement, but the family lands, the core wealth, were typically reserved for sons. It was not always an outright exclusion, but a systemic preference, a quiet assertion that a woman's connection to property was temporary or secondary, mediated through her husband or male relatives. This difference in expectation, this implicit value judgment placed on the male heir over the female, was a pervasive microaggression. It implied that a woman was not fully capable of stewardship, not fully worthy of perpetuating a legacy that was not immediately tied to her domestic role. Even in parts of Anglo-Saxon England, where women could hold property and had some rights, the social pressure and custom often steered inheritance toward sons. If a father had no sons, his daughters might inherit, but the ideal, the preferred outcome, was male succession. Charters and wills from the period, while sometimes showing women as beneficiaries, often reveal a pattern where land, the most significant form of wealth, was primarily transmitted through the male line. This was not always a direct insult, but it was a constant underlying message that the stability and continuity of the family depended on male heirs, reducing the female line to a contingency, a secondary option. In the nascent Islamic communities of the Arabian Peninsula, the emerging legal framework introduced specific detailed rules of inheritance. While these rules often granted women a defined share, which was a significant advancement in many respects compared to pre-Islamic tribal customs, it was often half the share of a male heir in similar positions. For example, a daughter might inherit half of what a son inherited from a parent. This was not a punitive measure, but based on the societal understanding of the time, where men were generally seen as the primary providers and protectors of the family, bearing financial responsibilities for their wives and children. While groundbreaking for its time, this differential share, even when legally enshrined, still subtly communicated an inherent, albeit functional, disparity in financial independence and control. Was a daily reminder that the family's financial backbone was considered to be male and female wealth, while legally recognized was often viewed through the lens of contribution to the male-headed household. Think of a young woman perhaps named Lyra in Constantinople, who watched as her brothers were schooled in the intricacies of trade and land management, destined to take over their father's thriving business. She, meanwhile, was taught household management, needlework, and the proper way to entertain guests. When her father spoke of the future, he always addressed his sons, discussing the legacy they would carry on, the lands they would oversee. Lyra might be provided for, certainly, but the sense of ownership, the feeling of being the true inheritor of her family's name and fortune, was subtly denied to her. It was a constant, quiet undermining of her potential to be a steward of wealth and power, simply because she was born a daughter. This inheritance disparity was more than just a legal technicality. It was a societal statement. It shaped educational opportunities, career paths, and even a woman's sense of self-worth within her family. It was a microaggression built into the very foundations of society, whispering that her contribution, while valuable in its own sphere, was not considered paramount for the continuation of the family's material legacy. It was a subtle yet profound demarcation of value that permeated daily life, from grand estates to humble farms, shaping expectations and roles without ever needing a harsh word or a direct insult. Number 11. The silence of propriety. Imagine living in a world where your very existence was often governed by an unspoken expectation that you should be seen and not heard, especially in spaces that extended beyond the immediate family unit. In 630, and across diverse cultures, women often faced a pervasive microaggression, the subtle yet powerful pressure to maintain silence, to be demure, to avoid drawing attention to themselves, particularly in public or mixed company. This was not always about silencing outright dissent, but about enforcing a quiet propriety that subtly communicated a woman's diminished authority and voice in wider society. Consider a gathering in a Tang Dynasty Chinese courtyard. Perhaps a family dispute is being mediated, or an important guest is being received. A woman, even one of high status, would be expected to maintain a dignified silence. Her presence might be acknowledged, she might even be consulted briefly on a domestic matter, but to speak out of turn, to offer an unprompted opinion on a matter of philosophy, politics, or even a detailed business transaction, it would invite a swift, subtle disapproval, a quiet, sidelong glance, or a polite but firm redirection from a male family member. The expectation was that her wisdom, if sought, would be shared quietly, perhaps even through a male intermediary, not directly asserted in the open forum. This societal norm, deeply rooted in Confucian principles of order and hierarchy, effectively created an environment where a woman's voice, though potentially intelligent and archival, was deemed less valuable in public discourse than a man's. In the Byzantine Empire, a woman of noble standing might attend a social gathering. She would be beautifully attired, a testament to her family status, but her conversational contributions would often be limited. While she might engage in light chatter with other women, or offer brief, polite remarks to enter into a detailed discussion on theology, military strategy, or urban governance with the men present, would be perceived as overstepping, as being too bold or unseemly. A man might gently interrupt her, or change the subject, or address his response to another man, effectively erasing her contribution. This was not always an intentional slight, but a pervasive social convention that implied a woman's opinions on such matters were either irrelevant or inappropriate for public airing. The quiet, graceful woman was lauded. The outspoken one, even if correct, often faced censure. Even within early Islamic communities, where women had specific rights, and could participate in certain spheres, there was a general cultural expectation of modesty and reserve, especially in public interactions. While women could voice concerns to authorities and participate in community life, there was often an emphasis on their speech being measured and direct, avoiding frivolousness or argumentation in certain contexts. A woman engaging in a heated debate with men in the marketplace might be subtly frowned upon, her character questioned or her words dismissed as emotional rather than logical. This societal pressure, while often tied to a broader concept of propriety for both genders, frequently had a disproportionate impact on women's perceived right to speak freely and assertively in varied public settings. It was a subtle pressure to always be less, to always be quieter, to always be more reserved. Consider a village setting in Anglo-Saxon England. A group of men might be gathered, discussing the harvest, the allocation of land, or the threat of neighboring tribes. A woman, perhaps even the lady of the manor, might be present, overseeing household tasks or offering refreshments. If she were to interject with an opinion on the best time to sow a particular crop or a strategic suggestion regarding defense, she might be met with polite but firm dismissal. Her words might be acknowledged, but quickly passed over, or perhaps repeated, by a man who would then be credited with the idea. It was a quiet erasure, a consistent message that her thoughts, while potentially valid, were not considered as weighty or authoritative as those of the men. Her domain was perceived to be inside the dwelling, not outside, and her voice, therefore, was to be kept within those boundaries. This silence of propriety was an everyday microaggression that permeated different strata of society. It was the way a woman's suggestion was attributed to her male counterpart, the subtle shift in conversation when she tried to steer it towards a topic considered unfeminine, the implicit understanding that certain topics were simply not for her public consumption or comment. It was a constant, quiet conditioning that taught women to measure their words, to choose their moments carefully and often, to simply hold their tongues. It was a subtle but profound way of signaling that her thoughts, her experiences, and her perspectives held less inherent value in the public square, fostering a sense of self-censorship and reducing the avenues through which women could exert influence or express their full self. Number 10. The public absence. Imagine the world around you filled with vibrant markets, bustling civic centers, religious ceremonies, and grand public spectacles. Yet you are consistently, subtly, and sometimes overtly excluded from the core of these public spheres. In 630, women across many different societies experienced a pervasive microaggression. Their general exclusion from formal public life, from the key spaces where power was exercised, decisions were made, and societal narratives were shaped. This was not always a harsh, enforced ban, but a deeply ingrained expectation that a woman's primary domain was the private domestic realm, thereby rendering her presence in public, especially in official capacities, as either anomalous or improper. Consider the Byzantine Empire, a sophisticated society with elaborate court rituals, vibrant commercial activity, and deeply interwoven religious life. While empresses and noblewomen could hold significant informal influence behind the scenes, and ordinary women participated in daily market exchanges, the formal structures of power, the imperial court, the city councils, the legal forums, the high ranks of the church, were overwhelmingly male. A woman would not typically sit on a city council, serve as a judge, or publicly debate theological points in a formal setting, unless she was a religious leader of an exclusively female community. This pervasive absence, while seemingly natural to the people of the time, was a constant, quiet statement. These spaces are not for you. Your intellect, your leadership, your opinions, while perhaps valued in your private sphere, are not considered suitable for the public arena where the empire's fate is decided. In Tang Dynasty, China, a period of immense cultural, flourishing, and bureaucratic sophistication, the formal machinery of government, The imperial examinations, the scholarly academies, the military command were almost exclusively, while certain powerful women, like future Empress Wu Zetian, would break these molds. Their stories were exceptional precisely because they defied the norm. For the vast majority of women, their influence was exerted within the household, through their sons, or by discreetly advising their husbands. The public sphere, with its competitive examinations, its intricate court politics, and its vast administrative apparatus, was effectively closed off. This absence was not a direct insult, but a constant, subtle reminder that your talents, however great, were not expected nor generally welcomed in the grand theaters of statecraft or public service. Across the Germanic kingdoms of Europe, such as the Anglo-Saxon lands, while women held considerable sway within their households and managed estates, their participation in the formal public assemblies, the Wittenagemuts, or folkmoots, where laws were deliberated and disputes resolved, was rare and often informal. When important decisions were made, when oaths were sworn in public, or when treaties were negotiated, it was almost exclusively men who stood forth. A woman's advice might be sought in private by her husband or father, but her voice in the public gathering, her physical presence in the hallowed spaces of governance, was largely absent. This pervasive pattern subtly communicated that the weight of public decision-making, the active shaping of the community's destiny, fell almost entirely upon male shoulders, leaving women on the periphery observers rather than participants. Even in the evolving societies of the Arabian Peninsula during the early Islamic period, while women enjoyed greater legal rights and were active participants in economic life, the formal leadership, roles in governance, religious authority, and military command were predominantly assumed by men. While women could and did contribute to community life and had the right to voice their opinions and seek justice, the official positions of public power, the ones that structured society and enforced laws, were generally beyond their reach. This public absence was a quiet reinforcement of societal roles, a subtle suggestion that women's contributions, though valued, were not meant to manifest as overt public leadership or authority, was a societal structure that, without needing to explicitly state it, conveyed the message: your place is not here, in the full glare of public responsibility and decision-making. Imagine a woman, perhaps a skilled craftswoman in Sasanian Persia, who wished to advocate for better trade routes or fair prices for her goods. She might have to send a male representative, or rely on her husband to speak on her behalf in the bustling marketplace or the council of merchants. Her expertise, her insights would be filtered through a male voice. She herself would likely not be expected to stand before the gathered men to argue her case directly. This was a daily unspoken microaggression, a continuous reinforcement that her direct engagement with public life was considered inappropriate, less effective, or simply not her designated role. It was the silence of her absence, the quiet exclusion, that spoke volumes about where women were positioned in the public imagination of power and authority. Number 9. The invisible contribution. Imagine dedicating your entire day, your life even, to vital work that sustains your family and community, yet your efforts are routinely overlooked, minimized, or simply taken for granted as an inherent part of your existence rather than as a valuable contribution. In 630 AD, women across different social strata and cultures frequently experienced a pervasive microaggression. Their immense contributions to household management, agricultural production, craft, indres, and child. This subtle erasure minimized their economic and social significance, denying them full recognition for their labor and skill. Consider a farming household in Anglo-Saxon England. While the men might toil in the fields preparing the soil and sowing the seeds, the women were equally indispensable. They were responsible for grinding grain into flour, baking bread, preserving food for the lean winter months, brewing ale, spinning wool into yarn, weaving cloth, making clothes for the entire family, tending to small livestock with lighter fieldwork. Turing Hall, yet, when the conversation turned to the household's prosperity or its contributions to the community, the emphasis often fell on the man of the house and his efforts in the fields. The woman's constant productive labor was simply assumed, an expected part of her role, rather than a quantifiable economic contribution worthy of overt praise or independent recognition. This was the quiet message. This is simply what you do. It's not work in the same esteemed sense. In a bustling city of the Byzantine Empire, a merchant's wife might manage the intricate finances of the household, oversee servants, prepare medicines, educate her children, and even secretly contribute to the family business by keeping records or managing a small personal trade. Her organizational skills, her literacy, her shrewdness might be the very reason the family's enterprise thrived. Yet in public, and often even in private conversations, her husband would be lauded as the head of the house, the one who provides. Her vital role as an administrator, a manager, and a silent partner was often overshadowed, considered simply a natural extension of her wifely duties. It was a subtle form of credit stealing where her intellectual and practical contributions were folded into her husband's overarching authority, thereby making them effectively invisible. Think of a woman in Sasanian Persia who was a skilled weaver, producing intricate carpets or exquisite garments that were highly valued. While her products might be sold for good prices, the credit for the family's wealth often went to her husband, who handled the sales and external dealings. Her artistic talent, her long hours hunched over a loom, her mastery of dyes and patterns, all this was understood as her function, not necessarily as a specialized, recognized skill that warranted independent commendation in the public eye. The focus would be on the product and the seller, not the producer, who was often relegated to the background, her name unmentioned. Even in early Islamic societies where women engaged in various economic activities and could own property, their domestic labor, from cooking and cleaning to child-rearing and education, was often considered an assumed part of their role, rather than a recognized economic contribution. While men were praised for their provision, women's immense efforts in maintaining the home and nurturing the next generation were often seen as a given. A man might thank his wife, but the societal narrative rarely elevated this work to the same level of esteem as, say, trading in the market or leading a caravan. It was a quiet devaluation, a constant message that some work, because it was done by women, was simply less noteworthy, less deserving of public acknowledgement. Imagine a woman in Tang Dynasty China managing a complex household with multiple generations, overseeing the education of her children, directing servants, and handling the intricate social protocols required of a noble family. Her days were filled with strategic decisions, diplomatic maneuvers within the family, and relentless administrative tasks. Yet her achievements were rarely spoken of outside the immediate family, and never with the same gravitas as a man's success in official examinations or military campaigns. Her intelligence and leadership were confined to the domestic sphere, celebrated quietly, if at all, and always implicitly understood as serving the male head of the household. This was a daily unspoken microaggression, the constant, subtle communication that her monumental contributions, because they occurred within the home, were somehow less significant, less real, than the work performed by men in the public sphere. Her invaluable labor was not just unpaid, but largely unacknowledged, fading into the background of a male-dominated narrative of achievement. Number 8. Being traded, not chosen. Imagine a young woman, perhaps just blooming into adulthood, whose entire future, her very person, was often viewed as a commodity, a strategic asset, to be exchanged in the complex game of alliances and social advancement. In 630, and across many cultures, women experienced a deeply ingrained microaggression, the quiet understanding that their marriages were often arrangements made by others for reasons that extended far beyond their personal desires or compatibility. This was the subtle, yet profoundly abile message that their autonomy and individual preferences were secondary to family honor, political expediency, or economic gain. They were to be traded, not truly chosen. Consider a noblewoman in the Byzantine Empire. Her marriage was almost certainly an intricate negotiation between powerful families. Her father would seek a match that elevated his family's social standing, solidified a political alliance, or secured valuable lands. The young woman herself would have little, if any, say in the matter. She might meet her prospective husband briefly, or not at all, before the formal engagement. Her feelings, her hopes, her dreams for a partner were largely irrelevant in the face of dynastic considerations. While it might be disguised as a good match for her, the underlying reality was that she was a valuable pawn in a larger game, her personal happiness subjugated to her family's strategic interests. This quiet reduction of her person to an object of exchange was a daily indignity, a constant reminder that her personal agency was severely limited. In Tang Dynasty, China, arranged marriages were the bedrock of society, deeply influenced by Confucian principles of family hierarchy and lineage. A young woman's marriage would be brokered by her parents, often with the help of a matchmaker, based on considerations of family status, wealth, and the suitability of astrological signs. Her personal preferences for a husband were not a factor. She was expected to accept her parents' decision with obedience and grace, understanding that her union was for the betterment of her family and the continuation of her husband's line. The subtle sting came not from harsh words, but from the complete absence of her voice in such a pivotal life decision. The very premise of the negotiation was that she was an item for exchange, her value determined by her family's prestige and her suitability for bearing sons, not by her individual qualities or desires as a partner. Across the Germanic kingdoms of Europe, marriage was often a means of forging alliances between different families or even clans. A chieftain might give his daughter in marriage to solidify a peace treaty or secure a military advantage. The young woman would be sent to a new, often unfamiliar community, expected to adapt and bear children for her new lord. While she might gain status through her marriage, the journey to that status often began with her being moved from one family's protection to another's, much like a valuable possession. The underlying microaggression was that her personal will, her emotional attachment, or her individual choice was utterly secondary to the larger political or social aims of the men around her. She was a bridge between families rather than an individual forging her own path. Even in the evolving societies of the Arabian Peninsula during the early Islamic period, while women gained certain rights in marriage and divorce, the practice of arranged marriages for strategic purposes was still prevalent. A father would often choose a suitable husband for his daughter, taking into account family, reputation, piety, and economic standing. While a woman generally had the right to refuse a marriage, this right was often difficult to exercise in practice due to immense social pressure and familial expectations. To refuse a match deemed honorable by her family could bring shame upon them, making such a choice a rare and often fraught act. The subtle implication was that her decision, even if legally permitted, was still subject to the broader considerations of her male guardians, and that her individual will was always implicitly weighed against the collective honor of her family. Imagine a young woman in Sasanian Persia, her heart perhaps secretly set on a local craftsman known for his kindness, but her father arranges her marriage to an older, wealthier nobleman from a distant province. She is not consulted, only informed. Her silent tears might be dismissed as youthful silliness, or she might be reminded of the honor and security this marriage would bring. The subtle message was that her feelings were unimportant, her individual desires irrelevant compared to the grander scheme of family advancement and social standing. She was not a partner choosing her companion. She was a valuable asset being transferred from one household to another, expected to fulfill a role that had been determined for her. This constant, quiet reduction of her person to a valuable yet unconsenting object was a pervasive microaggression, deeply shaping her understanding of her place in the world and her agency within it. Number 7. The burden of bearing and nurturing. Imagine a world where your most celebrated purpose, the very cornerstone of your worth, was constantly, subtly, and sometimes overtly tied to your biological capacity to bear children and nurture them. In 630, across a multitude of cultures, women experienced a pervasive microaggression, the quiet yet persistent societal message that their primary, if not sole value, lay in their roles as mothers and caregivers, often overshadowing their other talents, intelligence, or contributions. This was the silent yet powerful reduction of their identity to their reproductive and domestic functions. Consider a young woman in a bustling Byzantine city. Once married, the expectation to produce children, especially sons, was paramount. Her health, her diet, even her daily activities might be subtly scrutinized through the lens of her potential for fertility. If she struggled to conceive or bore only daughters, the pressure would mount perhaps in quiet whispers from family members or in the suggested remedies from older women. While her husband might still value her for other reasons, the underlying message from society was clear. Her ultimate success, her true fulfillment, lay in her ability to perpetuate the family line. Her intellectual pursuits, her skills in craft, her social graces, while appreciated, were secondary to her ability to fulfill this biological duty. It was a constant, unspoken reminder that her primary purpose was tied to her womb, not her mind or spirit. In Tang Dynasty, China, the emphasis on filial piety and ancestral worship meant that bearing sons was of critical importance for women. A woman standing within her husband's family, and indeed her overall security, was greatly enhanced by the birth of male heirs. If she failed to produce sons or produced only daughters, she might face subtle scorn, be overlooked in household decisions, or even face the threat of her husband taking a concubine to ensure the continuation of his lineage. This was not always expressed as direct anger, but as a deep, societal disappointment. Quiet message was, "You have not fulfilled your most crucial role." Her personality, her accomplishments, her intelligence, all faded into the background if she did not produce male offspring. Her identity was implicitly, and often explicitly, intertwined with her reproductive success. Across the Germanic kingdoms of Europe, where lineage and the strength of the clan were vital, a woman's fertility was highly prized. A barren woman, or one who bore only daughters, might be seen as a misfortune or even be seen as having displeased the gods. While a woman might contribute significantly to the household economy, her ultimate purpose, in the eyes of her community, was to produce healthy children, to strengthen the family, and ensure its continuity. This was not a harsh accusation, but a societal expectation that pervaded daily life. It was the quiet assessment of her worth based on her ability to procreate, subtly minimizing her other attributes and making her feel incomplete if she did not fulfill this role. Even in the evolving societies of the Arabian Peninsula during the early Islamic period, while motherhood was revered and women were granted significant status as mothers, the societal pressure to bear children, particularly sons, remained strong. A woman who bore many children, especially sons, would be highly respected and often gain considerable influence within her household and community. Conversely, a woman who struggled to conceive might feel the quiet weight of societal expectation, perhaps through the sympathetic glances of older women or the subtle shift in conversations regarding her future. While her spiritual and intellectual contributions were valued, the societal narrative often centered on her capacity to contribute to the family's lineage, subtly suggesting that her identity was deeply intrinsically linked to her role as a mother. Imagine a young woman in Sasanian Persia, recently married, who suffered a miscarriage. While outwardly she might receive sympathy, the underlying fear and anxiety, both hers and her family's, would revolve around her ability to conceive again and to carry a child to term. Conversations would inevitably turn to remedies for fertility or the importance of rest, all subtly reinforcing the idea that her primary focus, her overarching purpose, was to become a mother. Her personal grief over the loss might be overshadowed by the practical concern of her reproductive future. This was a continuous, quiet microaggression. The constant societal focus on her biological functions, subtly suggesting that her self-worth and societal acceptance were deeply, intrinsically tied to her ability to fulfill the role of child-bearer and nurturer, often overshadowing all her other qualities and aspirations. Number 6. Are you sure? Imagine that no matter how articulate, cheerful, or well-informed you might be, your competence is subtly, persistently, and often unconsciously questioned simply because of who you are. In 630 and Henyi, women across various cultures often faced a pervasive microaggression, the quiet skepticism directed at their judgments, their decisions, or their knowledge, particularly when these ventured beyond conventionally accepted feminine domains. This was the subtle yet powerful message that their intelligence, logic, or capability was inherently less reliable than a man's, often phrased as a gentle probe, but undermining nonetheless. Consider a woman managing a large estate in the Byzantine countryside, perhaps as a widow or the wife of an absentee husband. She might make shrewd decisions regarding crop rotation, the hiring of laborers, or the sale of produce in the market. When discussing these matters with a male relative, a neighboring landowner, or even a male servant, her instructions might be met with a polite yet insistent, "Are you sure this is the best course?" Or perhaps we should consult someone else, just to be certain. This was not an outright challenge, but a quiet questioning of her authority, an implicit suggestion that her judgment, because it came from a woman, might be less sound, less logical, or less capable of handling complex affairs. Her competence was always under a subtle microscope, awaiting male validation. In Tang Dynasty, China, a woman of high standing might be highly educated, perhaps even capable of composing poetry or managing complex household accounts. If she were to offer an opinion on a matter of philosophy, military strategy, or even a complex legal dispute within the family, a male listener might respond with a placid, "That is an interesting thought, but have you considered?" These seemingly benign phrases subtly dismissed her insight, implying that her logic was colored by her gender, and therefore less objective or universally applicable than a man's. It was a constant, quiet undermining of her intellectual contributions, framing them as inherently limited or less weighty. Across the Germanic kingdoms of Europe, a woman might be a skilled healer, knowledgeable about herbs and remedies. If a male elder or a traveling monk were to discuss a cure, her methods, even if effective, might be met with a subtle nod of polite skepticism or an unstated preference for male-derived wisdom. "Are you certain that concoction will work?" might be asked with an undercurrent of doubt, even if her healing record was impeccable. This was a quiet assertion that her knowledge, gained through experience and tradition, was somehow less authoritative, less real science than what a man might learn from scrolls or through official channels. Her expertise was constantly being subtly second-guessed. Even in the evolving societies of the Arabian Peninsula during the early Islamic period, where women participated in commerce and held specific legal rights, a woman's business acumen or her financial decisions might be quietly scrutinized more heavily than a man's. If a woman decided to invest in a caravan or purchase a significant piece of property, a male relative might ask, "Have you truly thought this through?" Or, "Are you absolutely confident in this venture?" These questions, while seemingly helpful, often carried an unspoken implication. Are you a woman truly capable of making such weighty financial decisions without male guidance? It was a subtle, yet persistent, chipping away at her self-confidence in her own judgment, fostering a sense that she needed constant external validation. Imagine a woman in Sasanian Persia, skilled in the art of calligraphy or manuscript illumination, who suggests a new technique for preparing pigments or a novel artistic composition. Her male colleagues or patrons might observe her work with a quiet appreciation, but then casually inquire, Is this truly the traditional way? Or are you certain this deviation will be well received? These questions, cloaked in concern for tradition or public reception, subtly conveyed a doubt in her innovative spirit, her artistic judgment, or her capacity to break from established norms effectively. Her creativity, her unique vision, was met not with outright rejection, but with a quiet, undermining skepticism that forced her to constantly prove herself, hinting that her inherent abilities were somehow less trustworthy because of her gender. This, are you sure, was a pervasive microaggression, a constant, quiet whisper that chipped away at a woman's confidence in her own intellect, skill, and decision-making capabilities. Number 5. The unquestioned male authority. Imagine living under a pervasive, unspoken rule where, no matter your own wisdom, skill, or direct responsibility, an ultimate authority always resided with a male figure, whether your father, husband, brother, or son. In 630, women across a myriad of cultures experienced a profound microaggression. The quiet, yet constant reminder that male authority was paramount and unquestionable, even within their own domestic domain, where they held significant power. This was the subtle message that their decisions, while perhaps executed by them, were always subject to a higher male validation, implying a perpetual state of guardianship. Consider a mature woman in a wealthy Byzantine household, the mistress of a grand estate, overseeing numerous servants, managing complex finances, and directing the edgeable power within her sphere. Yet, if her husband were present, or even if he were away and a male relative, like an adult son or brother-in-law, visited, her decisions, however sound, might be discussed with the male guest in a manner that implied his tacit approval was needed. A servant might seek confirmation from the visiting male relative on an order the mistress had just given, or a supplier might direct his questions to the male, even if the woman was the one making the purchasing decisions. This was not always an outright dismissal, but a subtle bypass of her direct authority, a quiet reinforcement that the ultimate seal of approval, the final word, always lay with a man. In Tang Dynasty China, a venerable mother-in-law might rule her household with an iron fist, managing every aspect of daily life from the smallest chore to the most significant family investment. Her word was law within her domestic domain. However, this authority was always implicitly understood to be in service of the male head of the household, her son or husband. If an external matter arose, or if there was a serious disagreement, the final decision would fall to the male patriarch. Her power, immense as it was derived from and subservient to the male line. The subtle microaggression was that her authority, no matter how absolute in practice, was never truly independent. It was a delegated and therefore ultimately conditional power, constantly reminding her that a man's word held ultimate sway. Across the Germanic kingdoms of Europe, a woman might be the mistress of a fortified hall, managing its defenses, its stores, and its people, while her husband was away at war or on a hunt. She would be expected to competently manage these affairs. However, upon her husband's return, or if a significant issue arose requiring external intervention, the authority would back to revert to him. Her leadership was temporary, a placeholder. It was not a question of her ability, but of her gender. The leadership role was inherently male. This was a quiet, almost instinctive shift in power that communicated, "You are capable, but this is not truly your ultimate domain. The man is the true and permanent head." Her competence was recognized, but her fundamental position of authority was always secondary. Even in the evolving societies of the Arabian Peninsula during the early Islamic period, while women enjoyed specific rights and could engage in economic activities independently, the concept of male guardianship, qawwama, over women was prevalent. This meant that men were generally considered the providers and protectors of women, and while women could own property and engage in legal matters, Their fathers, husbands, or brothers often served as their legal guardians. This did not necessarily mean control, but it implied a responsibility and ultimate authority. A woman making a significant transaction might still be advised to consult her guardian, or her guardian might be approached by others for consent. This was a subtle, yet constant reminder that her legal and social standing was often mediated through a male figure, implying a fundamental lack of independent, final authority in all spheres of her life. Imagine a woman in Sasanian Persia who was a skilled administrator of her family's vast agricultural lands. She knew the soils, the irrigation systems, and the optimal times for planting. Yet, when the time came for negotiating land leases or large crop sales, her husband, or even a less experienced male relative, would step forward to conduct the final negotiations. Her expertise would be acknowledged, perhaps, but the ultimate authority, the one who sealed the deal and represented the family in the public eye, would be male. This was a daily microaggression, a quiet, pervasive message that while her contribution was essential, the ultimate power, the public face of authority, always resided with a man, subtly diminishing her perceived autonomy and leadership. Number 4. Intellectual dismissal. Imagine possessing a keen mind, a thirst for knowledge, and a remarkable ability to understand complex ideas, only to have your intellectual capacity quietly, consistently, and subtly underestimated or dismissed simply because you are a woman. In 630, and across various civilizations, women frequently encountered a pervasive microaggression. The underlying societal assumption that their intellect was inherently less capable, less logical, or less significant than a man's, often leading to limited educational opportunities or the casual dismissal of their reasoned opinion. Consider a bright young woman in a wealthy Byzantine family, perhaps with access to tutors or the family library. She might secretly devour scrolls on philosophy, history, or even mathematics. However, her formal education would likely prioritize skills like household management, religious instruction, and social graces over rigorous intellectual training, while her brothers would be prepared for careers in law, administration, or the church. She would be subtly guided towards domesticity and marriage. When she expressed an astute observation about a theological debate or a political maneuver, she might be met with a paternalistic smile, a casual change of subject, or a comment like, "That's very clever for a woman." This was not an outright insult, but a quiet, dismissive pat on the head, subtly communicating that her intellectual curiosity was charming but ultimately not serious, or not on par with a man's. Her intelligence was seen as an anomaly rather than an expectation. In Tang Dynasty China, where scholarly achievement through rigorous examinations was the path to power and prestige, women were almost entirely excluded from this system. While some women, particularly in elite circles, received education in literature, poetry, and arts, this was primarily for their cultural refinement within the domestic sphere. A woman who dared to express a profound philosophical insight or a deep understanding of governance would be met with quiet surprise, if not gentle disapproval. Her ideas might be considered charming or unusual, but rarely taken with the same intellectual gravitas as a man's. The underlying microaggression was that the highest forms of intellectual pursuit and recognition were reserved for men, and a woman's intellectual capacity, no matter how evident, was inherently less suited for such endeavors. Across the Germanic kingdoms of Europe, where literacy was less widespread but oral traditions and practical knowledge were highly valued, a woman might possess immense practical wisdom inherited from generations of female ancestors on topics like healing, animal husbandry, or agricultural cycles. Yet, in a discussion about community planning or legal matters, her insights might be quietly overlooked or attributed to women's intuition rather than sound reasoning. If she offered a logical solution to a problem, a man might pause, consider it, and then reiterate the same solution as if it were his own. subtly erasing her intellectual contribution. It was a constant, quiet undermining of her rational capabilities, categorizing her wisdom as something less robust than male intellect. Even in the evolving societies of the Arabian Peninsula during the early Islamic period, while women were encouraged to seek knowledge and notable female scholars and poets existed, their intellectual contributions were often viewed through a different lens than men's. A woman might excel in religious scholarship or poetry, but her interpretations or insights might be subtly questioned or weighed less heavily than those of male scholars. There might be a quiet expectation that her learning would primarily serve her domestic duties or religious piety, rather than contributing to broader theological or philosophical discourse in the same way a man's would. This was a subtle, yet persistent communication that her intellectual sphere, while important, was ultimately separate and perhaps less authoritative than the male intellectual domain. Imagine a woman in Sasanian Persia who was a gifted storyteller or poet capable of intricate narratives and profound verses. When she shared her work, it might be praised for its beauty or emotional depth, but rarely for its intellectual rigor or philosophical insights in the way a male poet's work would be. Her cleverness might be attributed to her charm or her emotional nature rather than to pure intellectual brilliance. This was a daily microaggression, a quiet yet constant message that her mental prowess, while perhaps entertaining, was not to be taken as seriously as a man's, subtly denying her the full scope of her intellectual identity and potential. Number 3. That's a man's task. Imagine a world where your aspirations, your skills, or even your simple desire to contribute in a particular way were met with a quiet, yet firm barrier, subtly reinforced by the pervasive societal expectation that some tasks, some roles, some entire spheres of life were simply not for you. In 630 AD, women across diverse cultures frequently encountered a pervasive microaggression, the subtle yet powerful dismissal of their capacity or suitability for roles deemed masculine, regardless of their actual abilities or interests. This was the quiet enforcement of gender roles, implicitly stating, "Your place is here, not there." Consider a young woman in a Byzantine city who might show a keen interest in her father's trade, perhaps in shipbuilding or architecture. She might possess a natural aptitude for understanding structures or managing complex projects. However, her interest would likely be met with polite amusement or gentle redirection. Her father might say, "That's a man's concern, my dear. You should focus on your embroidery." This was not an accusation of inability, but a societal decree, a quiet shunting into a predefined lane. The subtle message was that her talents, no matter how pronounced, were inappropriate for certain domains, simply because she was female. Her potential was curtailed by an invisible boundary. In Tang Dynasty China, a woman from a scholarly family might demonstrate a remarkable understanding of classical texts or strategic thinking. She might even secretly wish to take the imperial examinations and pursue a career in civil service. However, this path was entirely closed to her. Her education would be steered towards literary and artistic accomplishments, considered suitable for a cultivated lady, not for a public official. The very idea of her entering public administration would be unthinkable, a source of quiet scandal. The society would subtly communicate, through the absence of such opportunities and the presence of strict gendered expectations, "This is a man's task, a man's world. Your talents, however great, are for a different purpose." Across the Germanic kingdoms of Europe, a woman might be a skilled horsewoman capable of hunting or even leading men in times of crisis, as some historical accounts hint at. However, the everyday expectation was that martial pursuits, legal disputes in public, or long-distance trading were largely male domains. If a woman expressed a desire to train as a warrior or to represent her family in a formal legal assembly, she would likely be met with quiet bewilderment or even a gentle but firm refusal. Her strength or courage might be admired in a personal capacity, but the formal roles associated with those traits were subtly denied to her because of her gender. It was the quiet, consistent assertion that her capabilities, while valuable, were not meant for certain societal functions. Even in the evolving societies of the Arabian Peninsula during the early Islamic period, while women participated in economic life and could own property, specific roles such as leading public prayers, holding judicial office, or commanding armies were generally reserved for men. If a woman demonstrated strong leadership qualities or strategic acumen, these talents might be appreciated within her household or a women's community. But the application of these talents in the broader public and religious spheres was subtly yet firmly curtailed. Underlying microaggression was that certain positions of authority, certain forms of public leadership, were inherently man's tasks, regardless of an individual woman's personal qualifications. Imagine a woman in Sasanian Persia who had a natural gift for mathematics and accounting, perhaps demonstrating a better grasp of figures than the male scribes in her family's employ. If she were to suggest a more efficient way to manage the granary's inventories or to calculate the yield of a harvest, her ideas might be accepted, but the actual implementation, the direct management of those aspects, would remain firmly in male hands. She might be subtly praised for her cleverness, but then quietly reminded that the official handling of such matters was a man's responsibility. This was a daily unspoken microaggression, the constant subtle communication that her innate talents and skills, while perhaps recognized, were not destined for roles that society had exclusively designated as masculine, effectively limiting her potential and narrowing her sphere of influence. Number 2. The constant gaze of judgment. Imagine living in a world where your every move, your every utterance, your very presence was under a constant, unspoken yet keenly felt scrutiny, primarily judged by how well you adhered to societal expectations of modesty, decorum, and familial honor. In 630, and across various cultures, women often experienced a pervasive microaggression, the relentless, subtle judgment stemming from the honor culture of the time, where a woman's perceived purity, demeanor, or even the way she carried herself could reflect profoundly on the reputation of her entire family. This was the quiet, ever-present weight of expectations implying, "Do not bring shame upon us." Consider a young woman walking through the streets of a bustling city in the Byzantine Empire. Her attire, her gait, the way she met or avoided glances, all were subject to subtle assessment. If her veil slipped too far, if she laughed too loudly, or if she conversed with a male stranger for too long, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the expressions of passersby might occur. She might not hear a single word of criticism, but the subtle narrowing of eyes, the hushed whispers among older women, or the quick disapproving glance from a male relative would convey a clear message: you are not upholding the expected standard. Her personal behavior was seen not as an individual choice, but as a public reflection of her family's respectability, making her a constant, silent bearer of familial honor. In Tang Dynasty, China, a woman of noble status was expected to embody grace, propriety, and reserve. Her conduct in public, her interactions with male guests, and even the subtle nuances of her speech were constantly observed. If she was perceived as too assertive, too boisterous, or too unconventional, she might quietly become the subject of gossip. Her family's reputation could be subtly tarnished, not by any major transgression, but by her perceived failure to embody the ideal of feminine decorum. The subtle microaggression was the constant pressure to conform, to be a living embodiment of societal expectations, with the implicit threat of quiet social ostracization if she strayed, implying, "Your every public action defines us." Across the Germanic kingdoms of Europe, while societies were often less formal than imperial courts, a woman's reputation for chastity and modesty was paramount. A young woman attending a communal feast or gathering might be observed for her interactions, her demeanor, and how she managed herself. Any perceived flirtatiousness or behavior that strayed from expected modesty could lead to quiet whispers, a subtle diminishment of her marriage prospects, or even her family's standing in the community. It was not always an accusation, but a constant unspoken judgment that placed the burden of upholding community standards of morality squarely on her shoulders, subtly implying, "Your behavior is a public spectacle that reflects on us all." Even in the evolving societies of the Arabian Peninsula during the early Islamic period, where women had specific rights and could participate in public life, there was a strong cultural emphasis on modesty and proper conduct, particularly for women. A woman stepping out into the marketplace might be expected to dress and behave in a way that avoided drawing undue attention. If she spoke too loudly, or if her head covering was not worn to the expected standard, she might receive quiet, disapproving glances. These were not always direct condemnations, but pervasive social cues that communicated, "You are being watched, and your adherence to propriety is being assessed," subtly reinforcing the idea that her public presentation was a constant test of her moral character. Imagine a young woman in Sasanian Persia, recently married, who attended a public festival. She might be dressed beautifully, but the subtle scrutiny from her new in-laws, her husband's male friends, or even casual onlookers would be palpable. Was her veil too loose? Did she smile too readily at a male stranger? Any minor deviation could lead to a quiet, pointed remark later, or a look of disapproval from her husband. This was a daily, unspoken microaggression. The constant, subtle communication that her self-expression, her natural joy, or her personal choices were always secondary to the unwritten code of honor and public appearance, leaving her in a perpetual state of quiet self-monitoring, afraid of subtly displeasing, or worse, shaming her family. Number 1. Being seen, not heard. Imagine having thoughts, opinions, and insights that were clear and present in your mind, yet discovering time and again that when you spoke them aloud, they seemed to dissipate into thin air, or were politely acknowledged, and then completely ignored. In 630, and across many cultures, women often experience the most pervasive and subtle microaggression. The quiet dismissal of their voices, the systematic overlooking of their contributions to conversations, and the general societal expectation that their primary role was to be observed rather than to actively participate in traditional in male-dominated settings that their primary role was to be observed rather than to actor. This was the insidious message. Your presence is noted, but your voice is not needed. Consider a family meal in a prosperous household in the Byzantine Empire. The men might be discussing business, politics, or religious matters. A woman, perhaps a wise elder matriarch, might offer an astute observation or a pertinent piece of information. Her comment might be met with a nod, perhaps a polite "Indeed, mother," but then the conversation would immediately revert to the male speakers as if her interjection was a mere formality or a brief interruption. Her point, however valid, would not be deeply engaged with, nor would it shift the direction of the discussion. It was a subtle yet profound act of conversational erasure, communicating that her words, while heard, did not carry the same weight or authority as those of the men. In Tang Dynasty China, during a social gathering where scholars and officials might be debating philosophy or strategy, a woman might be present, perhaps serving tea or sitting quietly. If she were to offer an opinion, however well-reasoned, it might be met with a polite smile, a gentle, "That's an interesting thought," and then the male speakers would continue their discourse as if she had not spoken. Her input was a ripple, not a stone thrown into the pond. This pervasive practice subtly reinforced the idea that public discourse was a male domain, and that a woman's contribution, while perhaps charming, was not meant to be taken seriously as an intellectual or authoritative statement. Across the Germanic kingdoms of Europe, during a community meeting in the longhouse where important decisions about land or justice were being made, women would usually be present but rarely speak directly. While their concerns might be voiced by a male relative, A woman who attempted to address the assembly herself might be met with polite but firm silence, or a quick redirection by a male elder. Her words would be treated as an anomaly, an inappropriate break from custom, implicitly conveying that the public forum for speech was for men, and her voice, however urgent, had no place there. It was a constant quiet signaling that the act of speaking in public, of asserting one's opinion directly, was a male prerogative. Even in the evolving societies of the Arabian Peninsula, during the early Islamic period, while women had specific rights and could voice complaints to authorities, the general societal dynamic in public discourse often favored men. In a gathering of merchants or a tribal council, a woman's attempt to directly participate in a negotiation or a debate might be met with a slight pause, a respectful but firm acknowledgement, and then the conversation would proceed with the men, often without her input being integrated. While she might be listened to individually, her voice in a group setting, especially where men were deliberating, was often subtly marginalized. This was a quiet, pervasive message that her direct verbal contribution in certain spheres was less valued, less necessary, or less authoritative than that of a man. Imagine a woman in Sasanian Persia who was an expert in herbs and healing, and during a discussion about a local illness, she offers crucial advice on remedies or prevention. Her advice might be heard, perhaps even silently noted, but the discussion on how to implement it or who would take action would likely be dominated by the men, who would then be seen as the decision makers. Her wisdom was acknowledged, but her agency in the conversation, her ability to truly lead the discussion or be seen as the ultimate authority, was quietly bypassed. This was a daily, unspoken microaggression, the constant subtle communication that her intellect, her knowledge, and her experiences were to be received passively rather than actively engaged, with effectively reducing her to an observer in her own life, seen but not truly heard.